Many welcomes and thank you. We're finally here. I know some of you signed up in February and March and then got messages from time to time, and so here we are. We're so happy to be able to host you, and we're especially happy to be able to include people who couldn't ordinarily come. And this entire institute is courtesy of grants from the Department of Education Title VI program, which, if you ever speak to your congressman, is probably the main way that teachers get professional development with universities, faculty, and others. So they tried to zero it out a couple of times, but didn't succeed because Congress came back and restored not just funding, but it actually added to the funding this four-year cycle. So we are at Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, a National Resource Center on the Middle East and North Africa. But as you know, who come here regularly, the Middle East and North Africa in the world, and the world in the Middle East and North Africa. So, I'm very glad to welcome you and to welcome our speakers who have come also from far and wide. We have a slight adjustment in the schedule due to a flight issue. And so one of our speakers who is going to kick it off for us today will be speaking in the afternoon, coming from my alma mater, the University of Rochester, as a matter of fact. And kindly, we have two speakers who agreed to move their presentations forward, and I'm going to introduce that one right now. And with a little bit of background, as I was researching this topic to find speakers and books and things like that, of which I have a whole box there I'll get out on the table shortly, I ran across the professor Farid Azfar, who was teaching a course on this subject. And I said, well, that will give me a lot of sources on it. And so I went through his bibliography, and I was very happy when he also agreed to speak and kind of kick off our day. So I think it's actually just perfect. Farid Azfar is an early modern European historian whose teaching and research takes him to the intersections of Atlantic history, the history of ideas, the history of sexuality, and urban history. He taught courses on the Enlightenment and early modern Europe. His work has been published in the Journal of British Studies, Historical Reflections, the London Journal, and the 18th Century Theory and Interpretation. He's currently at work on a book about the comparative intellectual and cultural history of the Ascenso Contract of 1713. Please welcome Dr. Farid Azfar.
So I'd like to start by thanking Susan and the organizers of this conference. It's truly an honor to be asked to speak before this audience, and wonderful to feel energy in the room. I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to talk about teaching in relation to research, because I never get that. Global Enlightenment, as Susan said, to which I refer in the title of this talk, is the name of the course I taught at Swarthmore College in the fall of 2014. At the center of the course were what I call the split identities of the 18th century, the century of Enlightenment and slavery. One aim of the course was to get the students to embrace the contradictions that this produced, and another was to provide a global context for these contradictions, to trace the role of non-European ideas, commodities, and practices in the formation of Enlightenment philosophies. As stated in the program for this conference, what we call Enlightenment thought emerged during the first global era, when Europeans were exposed to intellectual stimuli and challenges in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. My course began with the idea that it wasn't just in Europe, but all over the world, the material realities of the 18th century inspired new ways of thinking, that Enlightenment cosmopolitanism, a defining philosophy of the epoch, was a global event, comprehensible only in a global context. The course was also inspired, as this might suggest, by Sebastian Conrad, who I believe is speaking later in this conference, his then very recently published article in the AHR called Enlightenment and Global History. In her final Moodle post, one student described the project of the class better than I could have. Whether it was a European or global phenomenon, she wrote, the Enlightenment focused on fundamental shifts in how knowledge was perceived and recorded. What we have been discussing this semester was the global nature of these shifts and the resulting conflicts. The clash between knowledge systems revealed the pervasiveness of imperialism, as well as the anxiety related to the arrival of modernity. By examining the clash through the perspective of material history, we were able to trace the interplay between the virtual, ideological, and physical material manifestations of Enlightenment as it traveled the world. Overall, the final comment suggested that the course was successful in giving students a space in which to wrestle with tensions about diversity and difference, empiricism and skepticism, universalism and particularity. But while some of the students found reassurance in the dilemmas of Enlightenment, others felt the need for a context or a framework that wasn't provided. Our analysis of Enlightenment, wrote another student, often does not do enough to question alternative theories of development. It is entirely possible that we are overlooking an extremely simple and extremely important aspect that's not Enlightenment related. And another said, it's impossible for us to grasp just how much of our knowledge about India under British rule has been shaped by the panorama, referring to an article we read, or in other aspects of imperial ideology. If such ideology is ingrained within our understanding, how would we know? This suggests the need for constant examination and reconsideration of our systems of knowledge about this time period. So overall, it was clear that from these comments to me that the students weren't just interested in studying the Enlightenment historically. What they wanted was exposure to modes of thinking that would allow them to think more globally, to prepare themselves to live in a global world that they lived in. And there were many references to Swarthmore College and the globes in the library. It was fascinating reading these comments. In the 5 years since I've taught this course, I've taught a lot about what I would change. And as an alternative framework for global enlightenment, I began to think about a course that was centered around competing perspectives on global issues, perspectives that didn't involve into debates because of how the conditions of power shape the circulation of ideas. This new course would look more closely at how writers, artists, poets, philosophers, both inside and outside Europe, conceive the historical relationship between global, local, and regional processes. But the overall project of this other course would not be to trace the global origins of Enlightenment thought, but to locate Enlightenment thinking in the global 18th century. In doing so, it would provide the students with texts whose perspectives contradicted, or at least troubled, the ontological and epistemological foundations of the European text we were reading. I was thinking that maybe the comparative framework would make it possible to provide an alternative point of reference to the global world that Montesquieu, Raynal, or Gibbon were trying to describe. And in other words, it would get the students to think more openly about what needed to be enlightened. One thing I found was that the students were more than ready to embrace the idea that the mental traps, false binaries, and overdetermined categories of enlightenment were responsible for the distorted pictures that Europeans painted of non-European societies. But because the primary texts of the course were mostly written by Europeans, the students were left with a vague idea of what lay beyond the boundaries of perception. So I began to wonder what kinds of texts could be presented as serious competitors to Enlightenment writings about human desire, global capitalism, relationship between human and non-human nature, all the themes that we were covering. So at the center of my talk today is one such text, a cycle of poems called the Risalo by the Sindhi Sufi poet Shah Abdul Latif, who was born in the year 1690 and who died in the year 1752. The Risalo, which is set in the zone where the Indus River, which was the subject of this picture that I took ages, like a few years ago, where the Indus River meets the Arabian Sea. So this is where the province of Sindh is, just for everyone who doesn't know. The Risalo, which is set in the zone, is a defining cultural text of Sindh, which is a province in current-day Pakistan. And at that time, the Risalo was written a distant outpost of the Mughal Empire. At the center of the text is a vivid picture of the lives of peasants, herdsmen, potters, blacksmiths, weavers, butchers, minstrels, gypsies, nomads, yogis, doctors, musicians, and wine sellers in the province of Sindh in the first few decades of the 18th century. The protagonists of most of its surahs or verses are a series of tragic heroines, now known as the Seven Queens of Sindh, who long for their lovers against the backdrop of whirlpools, lakes, rivers, and mountains. In an article called Shah Abdul Latif and the English Romantic Poets, the Sindhi scholar Amina Khan Islami evokes the cultural significance of the text. One of our professors humorously remarked that people of Sindh are of two categories, the Latifites and the Sindhis. I beg to differ from the learned professors. All Sindhis are Latifites in their heart of hearts. The cultural centrality of the text is also suggested by the Sindh government's declaration in November of 2017 of a public holiday on one of the 3 days of the Ursa festival at Pit Shah, where thousands of Shah Latif's followers surrender to states of trance-like devotions and musical performances of the surahs. So, as a reminder of the mystical and transcendental aspect of the text, the festival at Pit Shah raises an obvious objection to the experiment of including a text like the Risalo in the course on the global enlightenment. And certainly it's true that Latif's Risalo is not a secular work of philosophy, that human desire in all its forms, whether it's carnal lust, yearning for place, acquisitive greed, exists in a complex relationship to divine love in all its forms. The Creator appears in the form of the beloved and also in the form of the monsoon clouds that shower the fields with raindrops that also symbolize divine love. In response to this objection, it could be said that the apparent purpose of Newton's experiments or Berkeley's proofs, which was also to prove the existence of God, hasn't stopped Enlightenment scholars from including them in the pantheon of Enlightenment. At the same time, the mystical quality of Russallo has not prevented 20th century Sindhi scholars from deploying this text in a self-consciously enlightened struggle against religious fanaticism and militant nationalism. Not only is Shah Latif a central subject of Sindhi scholarship in Shah Latif, as Sami's quote suggests, played a central role in the construction of a distinctly enlightened Sindhi identity. The discipline of Sindhology, which is itself a legacy of Enlightenment, drew upon the Russallo as its central defining text. In 2014, on a trip in Sindh, I visited the Museum of the Institute of Sindhology. Next to the dioramas depicting scenes of rural life were rooms that arranged the possessions of founding Sindhologists who had built their expertise on the work of Shah Latif. Along with all the references to Shah Latif as the Pope or Kant of Sindh, the museum reminded me of Conrad's argument about how non-European elites in late Qing China were shaped by forces and concerns of their own time, that the way in which the philosophers were translated, cited, and hijacked was structured by these conditions. But the larger point I want to make is not that Latif's Russallo should be called an Enlightenment text. It is that it is part of a global development, of which the Enlightenment was itself a symptom, this being the spirit of debate, dissent, and creativity that had animated the intellectual history of the global 18th century. In Sufistic thought, writes one Sindhi scholar, Maulana Rumi's style is rational argumentative, but Shah's thought is perceptive and mystical. It is imbued with human psychological shades and variations and esoteric spiritual mysteries. All the scholarship on the Russallo is centered in the profundity of its challenge to its own tradition. As a commentary on the changing world, it doesn't just reflect this tradition. Temporal lust for the lover and divine love for the creator are never just symbols for each other. Both are drivers of human desire, and together they produce a torrential synergy that drives the progression of human history. In what follows, I will argue, not only does the Russallo show aspects of sin that European travelers couldn't see, it shined a light of the embeddedness of forces like capitalism and climate in dimensions of human desire that were largely unseen by Enlightenment writers. By so doing, it painted a kaleidoscopic picture of endless spirals and circular processes of subjugation and liberation that also remain largely obscured in the simultaneous debates that were occurring in Europe at the same time. At the end of the talk, I will suggest why the genre of the text, as well as its apparent distance from Enlightenment debates, should not distract from its potential use in thinking about a contemporary problem like climate change, which our students are always thinking about, both with and against the grain of debates over the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, all these debates that are inundated with ideas of Enlightenment. As a mystical poem of the Sufi tradition that also describes the historical logic of global forces like capitalism and climate, the Russallo challenges the association between the Enlightenment and historical thinking about these subjects. Not only do the constraints of the genre not prevent it from describing the historical relationship between these forces and the insatiable qualities of human desire, they open up new ways of imagining how these domains of historical experience are constituted by each other. By so doing, the text undermines the idea that a historical understanding of these forces has to depend on a secularism that is supposedly specific to Enlightenment. At the same time, the picture it paints raises questions that can be studied by historians doing research in archives and using empirical methodologies that are legacies of Enlightenment. Let me start with a brief summary of what we've learned from the historical scholarship on Sindh about the context for the Russallo. In 1690, when the poet was born, the province of Sindh was coming increasingly under the political and fiscal control of the Mughal Empire, of which it had technically been a part since 1595. The death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in the year 1707 led to the rise of a theocratic and feudal state of the Kalhoros. Mughal bureaucrats and Sindhi feudals were both responsible for the persecution and execution of Shah Inayat, another Sindhi Sufi mystic, in the year 1717, under the pretext that he tried to overthrow the established rule. At the same time, the commercial networks of the Hindu merchants were linking the Sindhi city of Thatta to the port towns of Aden, Muscat, Surat, and Gale. In the 17th century, these merchants had acted as fundraisers for the Portuguese, financing their expansion in the Gulf in the face of competition from their Dutch and British rivals. At the time that Latif was writing, they had begun to acquire their own ships instead of relying on European merchants. All of these developments are context for a much discussed verse from Sur Siri Rag, a poem which ostensibly offers spiritual advice to Sindhi merchants making perilous journeys to Aden and Muscat. My bark in midstream may sail, what was taught so perfect now to fail. The guides are not to be seen in rightful place, the prowling pirates up and down do pace. In an article entitled Shah Abdul Latif and the East India Company, Sindhi scholar S.Q. Fatimi writes that this passage offers a quote-unquote clarion call of national resistance to Western colonialism. Drawing on Ansari's translation, he writes that the word Farangi epitomizes all the bitterness that Easterners felt towards their Western colonizers. According to a Sindhi speaker I spoke to, the phrase translates more specifically into European river robbers. And the passage, and I'm more at peace with Fatimi's idea that the passage contains a prophetic warning against the consequences of the most incompetent Mughal ruler Farrukh Sayyar's Firman of 1717, which made the companies trade customs-free throughout the imperial territories. I'm not so sure about the clarion call, but the larger point that Fatimi is making about the imperial critique at the heart of the text is borne out by an anti-colonialism that is all there throughout this text, and that takes as its target the fiscal, military, and bureaucratic agents of the Mughal Empire. "Oh scribe," says the poet in one of the other poems, "why do you pile pages on pages? You may turn 20 pages, but the letter is the same." In another, he says, "The brave traders have lost their strength, the water is dried up, and the tax collectors have gone." Many references to tax collectors all throughout the poems. As Amanullah Mandaman, who's another Sindhi scholar, suggested, Latif was both describing and trying to fight back the psychic states of subjugation produced by Mughal rule and all these other forces. They're operating in sin at the same time. The story of the psychic state is also part of the larger scene that this poem paints, which is a scene of the risky world of maritime commerce. There's lots of spiritual and commercial advice that's mixed together in this poem. Remembering God, they came back from Aden, the poet says of faithful sailors. Trade in merchandise that does not become old by being in store. Use your wealth to do business that'll bring you salvation. This cautionary blend of advice also creates a vivid picture of the volatility of trade and commerce. In many ways, the poem reminds me of the sermons that were being delivered in London to the Levant Company merchants at this same time in history, which I've written about myself. If we will inspect our income, said one of those sermons, take care of our revenue, those noble talents God had entrusted in us, we may secure ourselves from all those thieves that would rob us of our treasure. Latif's advice to the sailors helps locate what the sermons are doing in a much broader global context than the one that I insinuated in my article. It suggests that the material realities of capitalism were raising new kinds of anxieties about the more universal human need to transcend the limits of providential design. At the same time, the picture he paints of this need is different both in its substance and lessons. The world it depicts is shape-shifting and filled with deception and counterfeit. This is a world that is populated by blacksmiths that hammered base metals and a new class of jewelers who didn't even know the value of lead. This is a picture as much of this material world as it is of the psychic state in which leaky boats with rotten pegs summon the fear of European river robbers or prowling pirates. The fear this figure induces is proportional to the fear of the sailors that keep sailing back into this perilous maritime world, regardless of all the risks, not only that, the risks of the pirates, but also of a blindness to a divine order that reveals itself in a storm that wrecks the boat of a sleeping sailor, whose toleration of this risk is also a measure of the insatiable quality of human desire. In advising the sailor, the poet doesn't just evoke the creator, but also the story of Soni, the subject of another Sur, who encases herself in an earthen jar and dives into the river Indus, only for the jar to break and crocodiles to tear her to pieces. In the turbulent currents of the river Indus, where pleasure and pain become indistinguishable, the poet finds a measure for fathoming the unstoppable power of human desire, both for the lover and for the creator. The river was strong, the poet writes, but the flow of her love was even stronger. These turbulent waves have held back the bravest of heroes, he writes, in a line that locates the tale of Suni in the Sindhi legend of Alexander. But those who have experienced the Indus refuse to rest in its islands. By evoking Soni in his advice to the sailor, the poet also forms a relationship between sexual desire and capitalist greed, linking them both to a divine order that is represented in the form of the lover. But the poet's advice to the sailor is also a picture of a historical reality in which spiritual, sexual, and material desire are also forces in the history of what we might call capitalism. This is the picture he goes on to develop in Sur Samandi, or a Melody of the Seafarers, which describes the sailors that return from ransacking Sri Lanka only to depart again through the eyes of the women that they keep abandoning repeatedly. When they hear of Lanka's gold, he writes, the sailors have no peace. At dawn they unfurl their sails and cross the salty sea. At the center of the poem is the perpetual contrast between the spectacle of material wealth, the flags of the rich merchants looking dazzling in every direction, and the bewildered longings of their wives. My beloved is going to leave and will not stay even if I weep. How can I stop the sailor's mother? As soon as he gets off the boat, he talks about leaving, giving me over to grief and casting my heart into the current. For all that was written on greed and avarice in Europe during the 18th century, I cannot think of a single text that looks at the problem from the perspective of sailors' wives. Certainly it is not singled out as a major effect that is worth noting. And inasmuch as it ever is, the point is never, as it seems to be here, the problem has no real or obvious solution. As a causal effect of capitalist raiding, the psychic and sexual torments of the sailors' abandoned wives are described by Charlotte Thief as an eternal reality. So I wonder if there might be some pedagogical value to assigning a poem like this alongside a text like Bernard Mandeville's Grumbling Hive, which was also a poetic ode about capitalism and human desire. Thus, every part was full of vice, writes Mandeville, yet the whole mass a paradise. This is a famous quote that foreshadowed the central argument of Fable of Bees, that private vices are public benefits. In Sur Samandi, the lusty vices of greed and avarice do not produce public benefits, but endless torments for the sailors' wives. Global capitalism, as the poet imagines it, is an endless spiral of moral tragedy. At the same time, the poet has no obvious solution to the moral and emotional damage it would cause, both as a centrifugal force that sent people out into the world and as a centripetal force that concentrated wealth and power. Much like Mandeville's picture of the grumbling hive that was written, this was a picture deeply embedded in a skepticism about traditional morality. But the vision of desire at the heart of the text isn't really the same as Mandeville's. In the trajectory of European intellectual history, it would have to await psychoanalysis, the Freudian death drive, and Lacanian jouissance with its interest in what lay beyond the pleasure principles, beyond the distinctions of pleasure and pain. It evokes Deleuze's idea that sexuality and love do not live in the bedroom of Oedipus, that they dream instead of wide open spaces and cause strange flows to circulate that do not let themselves be stopped within an established order. My point is not that Le Piece Rissalo is a proto-Deleuzian text, but that his vision of capitalism is based on a vision of human desire that stretched beyond the boundaries of perception of a formative text like Mandeville's Fable. And it's partly because the endless insatiability of human desire was not the subject of Mandeville's Fable or Grumbling Hive, but all the vignettes of the latter resolve themselves so easily. At one point, Mandeville writes, the haunting Chloe to live great had made her husband rob the state, but now she sells her furniture, which the Indies had been ransacked for. The vision of desire at the heart of the Rissalo results, by contrast, in scenes of actors caught inside endless spirals. The lake has dried up and the tax collectors have left, says the fisherman through whose voice the poet tells Sur Khatu, or Song of the Shark. I've had to borrow fish, God bring back the fisherman. Almighty Lord, do not let me be ashamed before the traders. The predatorial debt extractors that are pictured as descending on the fishing village of Kalachi make the fishermen more sensitive than ever to the risks and dangers that are lurking in these shark-infested waters. Perhaps the great fish has caught them, says the poet. The fisherman has not come home. Go sailors and attack, vent your fury on the evil creature. The dangers of trade and taxation are not just a metaphor for the terrors of the natural world. The former leads the sailors to the latter. The whirlpool of Karachi, writes the poet in the Sur, has a force that sweeps away anyone who enters it. No one realizes why their nets got tangled up. The way I read it, the whirlpool of Karachi is less a metaphor than a chronotope, a term coined by Michael Bertin to describe what happens when time takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible, and space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. If the castle is a chronotope in the medieval, then the whirlpool of Karachi is a chronotope of a causal knot, a suctioning force that remains unnamed, but which appears throughout the Rissalo, which keeps getting tighter and tighter, producing a historical condition from which it was now becoming harder than ever for everyone to escape. This is the force that keeps on sending the sailors back to Sri Lanka, leaving their wives distraught. This is also the force which acts upon the cotton spinning girls that are pictured in another poem, who come early in the morning to the spinning place, whose fine thread gets sold without being put on the scale and weighed, because the dealers are so keen for it, whose wheels eventually get broken, leaving cotton balls strewn on the ground, and desolation in the market. Spin while you can, says the poet to the girls, this opportunity is fleeting. And here he's ventriloquizing the voice of their masters. The fishing village of Kalachi, it was the founding site of the city of Karachi, which is the subject of a future project which this paper is scoping out. Growing up in Karachi in the 1980s, I attended a school that was founded in the year 1847. At school, we were taught that before the British annexed Sindh in 1843, Karachi was just a fishing village. So you can only imagine how surprised I was to learn that as early as 1781, Lieutenant John Porter was marveling at the great quantities of raw cotton that were being transported via Karachi town to the Malabar coast in Arabia. By the time we get to 1868, the Confederate blockade of the southern ports, the opening of the Suez Canal, construction of the Sindh Railway, cotton farms set up by the British in the vicinity of the Indus would transform Karachi into India's largest exporter of cotton. It would seem from this small vignette that the poet was right in some ways about the whirlpool of Karachi, as he was about the breaking of the cotton wheels. But not only was the text not assigned in my school, I cannot even imagine what my teachers would have said if I'd raised my hand in class to say that this Sindhi Sufi poet had been in some way prophetic. But I can imagine that whatever they'd have said would have been shaped by the way that the word enlightenment and ideas enlightenment were being used all around us on an everyday basis. I mention this in part because the post-colonial enlightenment is one of the declared themes of this conference, and also because my own experience is part of a broader global reality that is making me think the purpose and structure of a course called Global Enlightenment. Let me move now to the theme of climate. In the era of the Anthropocene, writes Dipesh Chakrabarty, we need enlightenment, that is reason, he writes, even more than in the past. But as Chakrabarty also observed, the climate change crisis also produces anxieties precisely around futures that we cannot visualize, and calls for thinking in multiple registers, mixing chronologies of species and capital history in ways that stretch in fundamental ways the very idea of historical understanding. Chakrabarty's view has itself been critiqued for its unproblematic post-Enlightenment universalism, but the larger point that he is making has been echoed by several writers, including Amitav Ghosh, who has recently argued that the failure of literary fiction to describe the problem of climate change comes from a moral and liberal individualism that's also a legacy of the Enlightenment. In Charlotte Frisalo, non-human nature isn't just a metaphor for human nature, but a reflection of a divine order that acts through human and non-human nature, thus producing emotional landscapes that are refractory and heterotopic, defined by the tension between the whole and the parts. Amongst the most famous is Sur Sarang, which describes the monsoon clouds raining down on Sindh. A musk-like perfume drifts across the plains, the peasants plow the fields, the prosperous farmer's wives rejoice as they milk happy buffaloes. But this iconography of plenty and abundance is haunted with histories of pain and suffering. O rain, says the poet, for God's sake, have taught for those who thirst. Make the waters in the level ground abundant, and make the price of grain cheap. This is not a poem that's supposed to be about drought, but it is drought that this line evokes. And the poet is careful to observe that even though the greenery is fragrant and the grass all piled up in heaps, the widows weep when they see the clouds and cry out thinking of their husbands. May the huts the widows built without their husbands not get soaked, he writes. If the north wind blows them down, to whom can they cry out? The plight of the widows reflects the association that is developed throughout the poem between the season of rain and the season of love. The rains only produce all this longing in the widows because they produce a climate of desire for everyone else. And the same rain which leaves the widows shivering in the cold also bankrupts the food hoarders, who are described as wringing their hands at the abundance of grain that is brought by the rain. As they turn the pages of this book, he writes of what the hoarders did before. 5 would become 15. May all the hoarders and all oppressors perish. So this is a line that recalls his views on scribes. This minor moment of poetic justice is just one part of a divine cartography that is also cosmopolitan. Because the world expands as the clouds are described as moving on to Istanbul, China, and Samarkand, and then returning then to the Sindhi capital of Umarkot via Rum, Kabul, Kandahar, Delhi, Deccan, Girnar, Jaisalmer, Bikaner, Bhuj, and Path. Oh God, says the poet, in one of the most quoted passages of the Risalo, make sin flourish forever. Dear friend and sweet beloved, make the whole world prosperous. I cannot help but think of the contrast between the scene described in this passage and the theory of climate that was evolving at this time in 18th century Europe, which is when it was that the ancient conception of climate, that of a space between parallels, was getting displaced by the vision of climate that appears in Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, in which warmth, which makes the body weak on the one hand and imagination vivid on the other hand, makes the Indians, i.e. Native Americans, so courageous in some respects and so weak in others. It's also to warmth that Montesquieu attributes Eastern despotism. It's to the speculative devotion of inhabitants of warm countries that we owe the birth of dervishing, says D'Alembert, quoting Montesquieu in Encyclopédie. Habitual drunkenness is a vice in cold countries. Well, there are plenty of drunks in Latif Fusalo, as there are plenty of alternative explanations of dervishism. But of course, we do not need this text to disprove Montesquieu's racist theory of Eastern climates. What I find more useful and inspiring is the narrative logic of the story that he tells about the monsoons, the way that it traces the contradictory physical, emotional, and spiritual effects of a single climactic event. The widow's flight compared to the peasant's joy is a reminder of a world in which one person's gain and pleasure is another person's pain and terror. And the money hoarder's plight is a sign of the absence of stable moral meaning, maybe even the absence of the creator's control. I find it useful because it is fundamentally at odds with Montesquieu's historical vision, not only of Eastern climates, but also the allegedly commercial climate of Europe, and the larger point that Montesquieu is making about the different speeds in which civilizations are progressing. My point is not that Sur-Sarong can be treated as a historical argument, but certainly that the stories it tells can be used as the basis of a different kind of history, one in which the crisis ends neither in a single apocalypse that washes away the sins of humanity, crisis being crisis that everyone's thinking about, the crisis of climate change, and nor in transcendence, in which innovation just allows us to easily transcend it. Its potential, I believe, lies in its tragic emotional realism, its refusal to accede an ordering principle to the cosmos, and its insistence on the differentiated nature of the human experience. In so doing, it provides a framework for thinking about cyclical repetitive processes, a framework that can challenge what we've learned from some enlightened figures in some of their texts, like Mandeville and Montesquieu and Grumbling Hive and Spirit of the Laws, about climate and capitalism. And what they say about the insatiable urges that underlie capitalist lust, Latif's poems contribute to how we might picture the future of the Anthropocene, or the Capitalocene, or what some call the racial Capitalocene. This they do precisely because they do not resolve the story in self-ordering system, or in a theory about the progression of civilizations. Let me be clear that by making this point, I am not trying to indict the whole of Enlightenment, that Mandeville and Montesquieu were vigorously contradicted by thinkers like Vico, Reynal, and Herder, and certainly there were several alternatives to the latter's way of thinking about climate. The Enlightenment, writes Judith Sklar, was a state of intellectual tension rather than a sequence of simple propositions. And nor am I saying that methodologies of Enlightenment should be abandoned in addressing the problem of climate change. The state of tension that Sklar is talking about was a fount of ideas that were far more useful than Montesquieu's. Ideas that do, in fact, make it possible to think about the endless spirals and suctioning forces that shaped the relationship between human and non-human nature. The Enlightenment is a font for ideas that can expose the limited efficacy of stopgap measures that worship its reason and ignore its skepticism. At the same time, I wonder if we can rely on the Enlightenment critique of the Enlightenment in the process of trying to picture what the Enlightenment couldn't see. The final text I'd like to discuss is the description of sin in Scottish adventurer Alexander Hamilton's New Account of the East Indies, which I had assigned an earlier version of Global Enlightenment. Published in the year 1727, the chapter describes Hamilton's journey to Sind in 1699, which was when he descended on the province, arriving from Malabar with a cargo worth 10,000 pounds, shooting down the Baloch rebels and Makran robbers who tried to attack his caravan, and galloping triumphantly into Tutta, where he met with the Mogul governor who promised to punish the robbers, and whom Hamilton gifted a looking glass, a gun, a gilded pistol, a saber blade, a dagger blade, and a gas pipe for his tobacco. For this, claimed Hamilton, he was feted for his valor and declared, quote-unquote, free denizen of Tutta, which meant in practice that he was freed of all custom tax and given the right to imprison his debtors, also to take their wives and children as payment for debt. This privilege, Hamilton observes, did mean singular service when term of payments came and was obliged to try the experiment of imprisoning. All this occurred against the backdrop of a frontier city that derived its precarious, unsettled feeling from its particular combination of riparian abundance, compliant autocracy, and the constant threat of catastrophe. On the one hand, Hamilton writes, the city was half empty because of a plague which had produced a death toll of 80,000. On the other hand, this was a country that abounded richly in wheat, rice, and legumes, which never knew the misery of famine because the Indus overflowed all the low grounds between the months of April and June. In addition to its delicious pomegranate, the best carp he had ever tasted, he marveled about the extraordinary convenience of traveling by ship up and down the river Indus. In an article about Hamilton's text, historian, literary scholar Robert Barclay posits that Hamilton demonstrated a sophisticated, if often intuitive, awareness of the feedback loops among climate, ecology, and culture. That new account recasts the epistemological status of observations of the natural world by defamiliarizing nature. What is more, rather than simplifying climate as a primary determinant of stereotyped Asian features, complexion, temper, he assumes that indigenous rulers or prominent merchants share the transcultural values, socio-political, economic, and moral subsumed under the rubric of civility. Therefore, writes Markley, climate, not race, becomes a crucial variable in differentiating the lands and ranges of the monsoonal tropics from countries in Europe or Caribbean colonies. Racial typologies are not part of his biocultural analytics. However racist the typology does or doesn't seem to Markley, I believe that Hamilton's attitude to the province of sin emblematizes what Cedric Robinson has described as the tendency of European civilization through capitalism not to homogenize, but to differentiate. In this, the Nawab is himself complicit, since in the decision to declare Hamilton a free denizen of Tutta, he produces a security that makes it possible for Hamilton to also discourse for months with learned professors, mobile nobles, Hindu merchants, and local boatmen, all this time extracting extremely valuable information about boats and crops and weather patterns. This is relevant especially because the historical map that Hamilton produced of this region would go on to inspire British colonials prospecting sin in the century that followed. In this regard, the text reflects the complicity of Enlightenment travel writers and mobile nobles with the creation of what Shah Latif calls the whirlpool of Karachi, what Francois Burgess has called the racial capitalist. The idea that the climate change crisis requires us to look back at the histories of slavery and capitalism and their effect on the environment. In other words, like the poems of Charles Latif's Risalah, Hamilton's account does help explain where we are today, despite itself. If the overall story of Hamilton's breezy account is of a region ripe with potential, the overall story of Latif's Risalah is of a region in which feudals, merchants, tax collectors, money hoarders, scribes, nobles, and even some European pirates together produced the historical conditions for the eternal perpetuation of the spiritual and temporal sufferings of fishermen, sailors, wives, and all the other characters. I wonder then about an exercise in which the students were asked to write a paragraph which used each of these texts to explain what the other could not see. Of course, there are many risks to this exercise. What if students resorted to using Hamilton's essay for evidence of the truth behind the poet's verses? What if it reinforced the distinction between the rational West and the mystical East? The risks are great. The case could be made that it would be even greater if Hamilton's account was presented with no other context but its own. At one point during his sojourn, this is the last passage I want to discuss, leave it up there just for discussion. At one point during his sojourn in Tutta, Hamilton describes a conversation he had with a Sindhi professor at one of Tutta's, what he called 400 colleges. I was very intimate with a sage who was a professor in theology and was reckoned to be a good historian. He asked me one day if I had heard of Alexander the Great in my country. He told me that their histories mentioned the same, but with some difference in the two kings' names and Alexander's passage of Indus. He said that their history mentioned Shah Hasundar and Paras, and that Alexander was a great magician. And summoning above 1 million of wild geese, they swam his army over the river, and that horses, elephants would never turn their heads towards the place where Alexander was. Now, Hamilton doesn't analyze the story, doesn't probe where it comes from, its cosmology in any way. He moves on to describe his time in Tutta, the plague, the boats, how uncomfortable he was at the holy festival. But decades later, the anecdote appears in George Sale's Universal History from the earliest account of time. And Sale writes, "From hence we may infer that the Indians have some ancient histories among them composed by their countrymen, though greatly disguised by fabulous incidents in the same manner as those of other nations. Sale does not see anything fabulous in the figure that Hamilton gives of Tata's 400 colleges, nor does he stop to wonder what the professor was trying to accomplish in trying to have this conversation with Hamilton. And even though animals would seem to play a major role in human events in Latif's Risalah, I actually don't think that the cosmology of the professor is the same as Latif's, especially given the muted rage that Latif directs at establishments of learning and at theologians in every way. As the program for this conference says, what we call Enlightenment thought emerged during the first global era when Europeans were exposed to intellectual stimuli and challenges in Asia, Africa, and America, that not only mercantile but also scholarly exchanges characterized this period and opened Europeans' horizons of linguistic, philosophical, historical, literary, and religious traditions to which they had not been previously exposed. I want to end this talk by reading a question about all the other traditions that didn't get transferred, all the other events in which horizons did not open, or to borrow a phrase from Landa Schiebinger, all the other non-transfers of knowledge. What do they tell us about what did get transferred? What do they tell us about what remains to be transferred? What do they tell us about the relationship between the epistemological perspective and imperial power, but also what do they tell us about the divisions within the societies? Like, for instance, what does the division of the conflict between a Sufi poet and a learned professor tell us about the ideas that did get imported into the Enlightenment? Finally, what are the other configurations of text and context that could be pedagogically useful and provocative? I don't know the answers to this question. I can't wait to learn more from this conference, and I know that any future version of the global Enlightenment will be in depth to the conversations that we will have. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for discussion to kick us off for today.
Oh, good. I didn't go over time.
No, you did not.
At the very beginning, you were talking about Rosalo, and I just didn't catch the spelling.
Oh, sorry.
And
Yeah.
whether or not that's the name of the poet or the name of the
Oh, yes,
the
yeah.
collection.
No, yeah. So it is. Let me show you. Can I get onto Google here?
You can, if you click escape, then it'll take you out of the.
There's the translation that I've used was just published by Harvard University Press, actually, like this year. There's several translations, and yeah. So Risalo is the name of the text, and the poet's name. This is the name, and that's the name of the text, Risalo, and the name of the poet is Shah Abdul Latif, and the translator of the recent version is Christopher Shackle. This is the name, so it just came out, and I'm happy to share any of the sources that I've quoted here with anyone. If you want. Sorry. Yeah.
I was just wondering, but you were asking, or you were talking about the sailors' wives and
Mhm.
how distraught they were about being left behind. Now, were these wives of local sailors who were traveling, presumed to what, Africa, Persia?
Yes.
Or is it made clear in the poem exactly?
That's a
what
really
they're
good
involved
question.
in?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually discussed that passage in another conference in May, and there was a medievalist who works on the trade who works on Sri Lanka actually, and on Dutch Sri Lanka. He said, well, how do we know that he's referring to what's happening at the point that he's living, or a much broader historical reality? I think that, I mean, so in this particular passage, he's, like in the first poem that I discussed, he's describing the sailors that are going to Aden. Let me actually pull up the map that I had at the beginning. So in the first of them, he's discussing, how do I don't know what happened. But in the first of the passages, he's discussing something that is happening at this time, which is the Indian Ocean slave trade and the participation of the merchants of Tata with the Portuguese and with the Omanis, who are actually taking over the slave trade in the early 18th century. So he's evoking a trade that is connected to the slave trade, although he doesn't mention slavery in that first section. He mentions
Could I just follow up on that?
And then the second one describes another trade that is also contemporary to the period. That's the trade of the Hindu merchants that are trading in Sri Lanka in the 17th and early 18th century. Yeah.
And sorry, I just wanted to follow up on the slave trade. Is that the slave trade like Iraq, Iran, the African slave trade to there, or is it slaves to India?
Right. Yeah. So actually, I mean, so there's the most kind of all the branches of African slavery of enslaved African peoples that came to India, the vast majority came to exactly this particular region. So even now in contemporary Pakistan, you have you have a stronger African presence in this part of the world than you do anywhere else in South Asia. But at the same time, there are also people who are enslaved, who are Indian, who are sent to other parts of India. And the word slavery is used throughout the Risalo to talk about both, both as a symbol of enslavement, which is divine subjugation, and also, I mean, scholars debate this, the extent to which it's all symbolic, and the extent to which all the times in which he's referring slaves and slavery, he is also referring to a reality that exists in the world around him. And that is actually something, so I mean, I quoted a couple of the Sindhi scholars. There's a huge body of Sindhi scholarship that's like, we need to take this text seriously because it's describing commercial realities, but that scholarship isn't fully engaging with the theme of slavery, not because it's in denial about slavery, but because the word slavery does have such a powerful symbolic meaning in Sufi poetry. I think that Latif isn't just thinking of enslavement as a symbol, but he's thinking about kind of gradients of enslavement, and he's thinking about subjugation that, that the self feels in the face of the creator as part of a continuum of experiences that also includes not just chattel slavery as we imagine it in the Atlantic context, but all the other ways in which people are enslaved by forces larger than them. So for instance, there's lots of stories about women that are kidnapped from their lovers, and they're taken to, the capital city and the castle, and they're pining for the desert, and one of those women says, it's not the way of the Marui to exchange their kinsmen for gold, referring to the tribesmen who live in the desert, so it's everywhere in the text. But to answer your question more simply, there is both a context of Indian Ocean slavery that is very much relevant to thinking about it, and other forms of enslavement that were pervasive in South Asia at this time, but are outside of the framework of Atlantic slavery.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're Shah Abdul Latif. Was he writing around the same time that Hamilton was writing his accounts, and would have Hamilton
Yes.
been familiar with this literature?
Well, he would not have been. Would Hamilton have been familiar, or?
When he was talking to the professors.
Right, yeah, I mean, so like, Hamilton comes in 1699, which is when Shah Abdul Latif is 9 years old, right? So, but, the phenomenon, I mean, the point I was trying to make with that last example is that like, the anger that Latif is directing towards, any anger he's directing towards the Europeans, the European river robbers, is also proportional to the anger he has at institutions of learning and the Mughal scribes and all the members of his own particular empire. So I think that, I mean, I don't think that Hamilton would have, Hamilton does not mention anything about, a Sufi poet that's becoming very popular because, Latif is only 9 then. But he does refer to, at many times, to what he sees as the extraordinarily pluralistic society of Sindh. So he talks about how the governor is Muslim, but the majority of the people are Hindu, and everybody is allowed to practice their religion as freely as they can. And then he describes very briefly at the end, like how uncomfortable he is because he's caught in a holy festival, and he's like, the smells are too much for me to bear. And then the story just ends, and he goes on to then talk about the other places to which he traveled. So, it's very fragmentary, the account, but even though the poet is not mentioned, there are many ways of locating many ways of thinking about the structure of feeling that's described in Latif's Risalo as a critical context for understanding this combination of pain and pleasure that Hamilton is always feeling in the whole time that he's spending in Tata. Yeah.
Just a curious question, is there a sense of caste in these
Right.
texts? And
Yes.
also vying with that, would it be anachronistic to see is there any kind of sense of humanity at work?
Of humanity.
Yeah, whether in Islamic sense, insania, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think, so yeah, I mean, but yes. I think the answer to both is yes. There are, the issue of caste does figure, but in terms of thinking about social, so it figures in the sense that, I mean, going back to the theme of slavery, there's many different passages in which he's like, in which characters whose voice he's speaking through say things like, well, I can't do this because I'm just a slave girl, right? And like, that actually is a reference also to forms of subjugation that are specific to caste relations in Hindu society. But he never uses the word caste because that doesn't exist as a concept. And he doesn't really center his critique of inequality on caste itself. Like, what I find interesting is that all the poems, none of the poems suggest that there's only one force oppressing one person. There's always multiple forces oppressing multiple people, and in that sense, which is a total anachronism, in some ways it's intersectional in the kinds of perspectives he's providing. Like, all the people that are being oppressed, caste is part of it, but it's also the Muslim theologians and, you know, the traders that are going in different directions. And so I think that actually is also partly what I see as the humanity, or the universalism of the text, is that I think, so on the one hand, I mean, there are many Sindhi scholars who have taken the passage where he describes the rains going up and down and saying that, you know, he has a universal conception of humanity, right? I think it's more heterotopic. And when I say heterotopic, I'm referring to Foucault's idea of the heterotopia, which is like, the idea that, you know, a library is a place that seems to be one place, but actually has all these different worlds contained inside it. And I think that its universalism is more heterotopic than it is cosmopolitan in the 18th century sense. And in thinking about this, there was an article by a scholar called Niall Green and Niall Green is talking about the 19th century, and he's saying that he's critiquing all these scholars of the Indian Ocean world who say that the Indian Ocean world was quote unquote cosmopolitan. And he's like, we need to stop conflating cosmopolitan with global, because it's true that the Indian Ocean world had people traveling in all directions, but the people who were traveling didn't always arrive at cosmopolitan conclusions. And in not arriving at those conclusions, they reveal a way of thinking that was outside of our association in between globalist and cosmopolitan. And I actually think that Latif is cosmopolitan in ways that the thinkers that Green is talking about are not. But I think that his sense of a universal reality is very much imbued with a sense of both of the universality of both of experiences of pain and suffering, but also of a world that's not defined, a world in which the suffering of one person isn't caused by one factor, but a larger constellation of oppressive forces.
But if I may just briefly follow, crucially for me, because I'd be really interested in this, does he feel that the suffering or the structures of suffering he is, are they unnatural? Should they not be taken? Because that is what caste does, right?
Yeah.
Caste, the whole point, the whole function of caste is to completely naturalize your suffering.
Right.
This is, you don't think that you shouldn't suffer because you are born to do this job. Does that take place?
No, I don't think so. But I mean, again, the question you're asking is so important, and it is like there's you could write a whole book on how that question has been answered in the amount of scholarship just on this text. But when he describes, so certainly there's no sense in which your caste, that you should just agree to suffer because of your caste. But there is a sense in which he believes that the desires that we have for the temporal world are fleeting themselves, and that wanting to be part of a larger entity is being willing to suffer pain so that you can also experience pleasure, and the place where pleasure meets pain, like in the story of the woman who dives down the river. Like, he thinks of that as a, you know, as a kind of, you know, as I think his advice is more about looking in all of his stories at that ambiguity. But there's no point at which I actually think that in relation to both to the Sufi poetry before him that we have read and to all the other, kind of, verbal and oral traditions that aren't recorded, he's fighting back exactly that. The idea that, you should just suffer because it's your lot to suffer. I think it's more, it is spiritualistic, but it's more realistic. It's like, well, suffering is not going to go away, but also whatever it is that causes us pain also causes us pleasure. The river is a source of pleasure, and the moment in which the woman drowns in the river and the jar breaks is described as a moment in which she's achieving something that she always wanted. Not as, it is a tragedy, but it's also, there's so much that's written about that scene and how in many ways it's partly about, well, would it have been better if she hadn't done that and had lived her life in misery and then not done the thing that allowed her to find the greater love, which is the love of the Creator. I don't know if that answers, but it's the best. We done?
This would be a really good time, I think, to, first of all, make a small announcement I forgot to make before. Due to a glitch in the database with all the names, people's schools got mixed up with their names because of an alphabetization error. However it happened. So we were thinking, actually Amy Sanders is here, who has been working with us on curriculum. She's the one who greeted you at the table, along with also Wendy Egan, who stepped in. Our other student aide seems to have had a problem this morning. I hope she's well. In any case, it would be a great icebreaker to go and find your school. The name of the person that So when we do our coffee break, maybe that'd be a fun thing to do. And we'll try to see if you can get paired up. And we're going to try to run the text again later. The next thing I want to say is definitely in reference to the, I know you're teachers and you know stuff happens. So, and if you, yeah, we could plan it that way. So we should have done it like those pictures with the head and the clothes, that we could have apart. Anyway, the other thing, more to the substance of this great talk, would be to raise some questions. We still have a good amount of time left for discussion. So raising some questions about what you have about the Enlightenment as a global phenomenon. As again, Professor Azfar has taught this course and has certainly done a lot of thinking about it. What is pertinent to your teaching, what questions you may have. This will kind of set us off for having a good discussion all week. This is a pretty esoteric topic, and I have to say I was blown away when in March 93 people signed up for this workshop, and I have to apologize also for the little bit tightness of the room. We're going to adjust that as we see. We've had cancellations and additions and one thing and another. So we'll get it sorted out, and please be patient with us.
Well, I was also astonished when I saw the program, and also all these people that are speaking. I mean, like these incredible scholars that are coming to speak. It's like it's like a syllabus, the people that are speaking at the conference. But I'm also really curious about, about experiences, and I think there's space in the conference for discussing that, right? Like about how students have reacted to different kinds of texts that relate, like what does enlightenment mean in teaching, and what is it? I'm wondering, like, I'm also just generally wondering, we don't have to talk about this now, but how it's changed over time. Like, are students, is there something about enlightenment that becomes more appealing in the world we're living in now than what existed 5 years ago? Are they bored by it? Are they inspired by it? I'm just really curious what the word means to them.
I teach high school, and one of the things my students are very interested in is, and it's not probably your area of expertise, maybe it is, I don't know, is the transfer of numerical understanding, Indian symbology that becomes Arabic numerals and travels into Europe. And so they kind of conflate as I think some textbooks do, the age of discovery or the scientific revolution with the Enlightenment. And so how would you either bring them together or separate them in your own area?
I mean, like, I don't blame them, because in grad school, we had to read like hundreds of books, and when I was studying for my prelims exams, and I remember having done them and had all these conversations with my professors, and then I remember going to one of my professors being like, I don't understand, how is the Enlightenment different from the Renaissance? All the time, there's so many definitions of the Renaissance that could be applied to the Enlightenment. And this wasn't out of a lack of knowledge, it was like out of too much reading of historical scholarship. And the definition that I can come up with the best is actually that, what my professor said was part of it. So he said, the real difference is that, so the Renaissance happens, and then, you have people that are recovering the texts of the ancients, they're thinking historically about the past and all that, and then you have a century of religious war and bloodshed. You have the wars of religion, you have the 30 Years' War, and that the Enlightenment is different from the Renaissance because it's like, it is reckoning with both the ideas that are produced by the Renaissance and the product of those ideas, and it's defined by there's a skepticism to the Enlightenment, and there's a pessimism to the Enlightenment that translates into a different, it translates into a different relationship that Enlightenment writers have to each other. But I think having said that, I think that it's also useful to remember that in some ways the students are right in that these are constructs, right? Like that one of the things that Sebastian Conrad says is that this whole idea of the Enlightenment being totally distinct from all other places is also a product of people that are making that up because we need to make sense of our past, and we need to tell stories about how we became better and smarter and all these other things over time. And so the Enlightenment seems to, it's evocative, and people like to talk about it. But I do think that there are major differences, but I think that those differences are better traced if we look at something like mathematical reasoning and how ideas about mathematical reasoning get transformed over the course of multiple centuries. And I think that, in a way, that's a really great teaching moment, right? Because if a student asks that and says that, you can be like, well, actually, you're referring to the Renaissance, but let's talk. How did this idea of mathematical reasoning, and also how did the value of, Indian or Arabic numerals change from the Renaissance and Enlightenment? That actually we can learn more from answering that simple question than we could from, this big meta-narrative in which the difference between the Enlightenment and the Renaissance is just the 17th century. Yeah.
I would say I also teach high school history, that the Enlightenment for my students is a very Eurocentric event, which is why I was interested in coming here and learning more about what I can convey to my students. And earlier in your talk, you talked about how the spirit of debate and skepticism was a global phenomenon. So I was wondering if you could articulate a little bit more about that, what other kinds of things could we be sharing with our students to say, hey, it's not just happening here. Here's other thinkers or writers, or obviously we have this poem. But is there any other things?
Yeah. So when I think about, actually, one model I was thinking of, I was like, what would it be like to teach a class on the global 18th century that was just comparing the work of Enlightenment historians on human desire, and comparing that to all the Sufi poetry, not just Sufi poetry, but all the poetry that's written everywhere from Persia to India, also in the 18th century, because all those poets are fighting each other. Not fighting, but they're all referring each other, they're all debating each other. Latif is debating Rumi, all these other people they're having these conversations with each other, and at the same time, they're responding to events that are occurring in the world around them. Like the poets in the middle of India are responding to to the collapse of the Mughal Empire, and the poets in Persia are responding to the Afghan invasion of Isfahan. There are all these different forces that these people are reacting to, and in the process, they're also having very different ideas about how much reason is enough, and the relationship between reason and desire and all these things. They're not having those debates in a public sphere that's recognizably enlightened, but they are having those debates in public spheres also. They're having mushairas in which people are speaking poems out to each other. All these things are happening. It's an incredibly vibrant period. And it's not the Enlightenment, but it is a period of enormous discussion, debate. The whole language of Urdu forms in this period. So, I mean, I was thinking that if I taught a course like this, I mean, I would have to, first of all, learn more about that, and B, the students would have to, like, read. There's actually a lot of accessible scholarship about Sufism and Sufi poetry and about these kinds of debates. I would have to read that, and one of the questions or conversations we could have is like, you know, we can say, not to say that the stuff that was happening in Enlightenment was bad or that, you know, or it was wrong, but like, what do we look at? What do we get when we look at these two debates together that we wouldn't if we only were to look at one? So, I mean, I would point at that. I also think, I mean, in another version of the talk, I took out the section where I had actually created a list of multiple other debates that are happening, not just in Sufi Islam, but all over the place. And a lot of those debates are, some of them are referred to in the articles I signed in the earlier version of the class. So for instance, Jose Canizares Esquerra writes this book called How to Write the History of the New World, and a lot of it is about these relationships between, you know, Native American and Spanish astrologers and astronomers in the 17th and 18th century. There's a lot of work on 18th century China. Japan is like, you know, in Japanese history, the 18th century is absolutely critical. There's lots of stuff that's happening. There's really interesting work that's now being done on Enlightenment ideas in West Africa, and not about Enlightenment in this sense, but about, you know, interactions and conversations that are happening that are outside of the ambit that historians of slavery look at those archives. They don't pay attention to that. So there's a lot of interesting work, but I mean, in thinking about what it would mean to make a really global 18th century as a course, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do it, but I think that if I did, it might look more like a comparison of two genres and just a conversation about these two perspectives. But I would love to know more about the other sources also. Yeah.
So my question is similar. So I wondered if you knew, you addressed it a little bit, but I wanted to be more concrete. Like in the Enlightenment, it's all about Montesquieu, Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire.
Right.
So is there a person, you mentioned the Sufi poets, but is there a person you can align with one of those? Who is if we look at...
Who's the most Sufistic of the philosophers?
Right, the global phenomenon. Who is the Montesquieu? Who is the Voltaire? Like, could you give us a name that could give us a start? And then my second question is, you know, with these novel ideas of the Enlightenment about, you know, humanity and dignity, why do the philosophes seem to stop in Europe and not sort of apply these principles to the Islamic world? Are they just not adept? Are they?
I'm interested in what you mean by apply.
Well, it's like they don't. To me, they don't go far enough. I mean, at least this is my training, right?
Yeah.
So, like she just talked about Eurocentric.
Yeah.
We don't see Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke sort of talking about Islamic regimes, tyranny, patriarchy. Is it just because they're not aware, or is it just because we're in Europe, this is what we want to deal with, or?
So let me answer the second question first. I mean, they do. I mean, Montesquieu does talk about tyranny and about Eastern tyranny and despotism all throughout, right? Like all these people, they are really interested in these other, you know, in Eastern societies. But they use those Eastern societies to produce, the despotism of the East is used as part of a story about the universalism that they want to idealize, and that universalism is tied to their perspective on the destiny of Europe, right? Like what they're not interested in are the debates and conflicts that are occurring within the part of the world that they're calling Eastern. And what they're also not interested in is why the idea of whether something is particular or universal is not as resonant in these contexts as it is to them, because their interest in the word universal is so directly tied to the imperial project. So the aims of their debates or their interest in the East are very different from the debates that are happening in India or in Persia. But in their when I think of their Eurocentrism, I think about how the questions of Europe frame the questions that they ask about these other places. They're not asking questions that people in these other places are asking about themselves until those people start reading the works of Enlightenment philosophers, and then in the late 18th century and the 19th century, all these Indian intellectuals are like, oh yes, we're really tyrannical, we must compare ourselves to Europe, right? As opposed to like, what is this difference between a learned and a vernacular tradition? Why do we reject all our vernacular traditions and uphold our learned ones? So, I don't know, but as to the question of why are they the way they are? I don't know. I mean, the Enlightenment, I don't know. I mean, like, there's so many different, they ask that question about themselves also, right? Which is what I tell my students. I'm like, actually these people are very useful in thinking about the Enlightenment because they are always critiquing each other. As for who I would align, I actually don't know. I don't know if I would align a philosopher for every poet, but I do think that, I keep thinking about Vico a lot, who writes The New Science, and I've always loved the work of Vico because it is very non-linear and kind of chaotic, but I find that my students actually love reading Vico, and they love reading about Vico. There's something about, because he has all these myths and legends that are mixed with things that are actually happening, and he's a totally eccentric character, and he doesn't become hugely significant in terms of influential in the context of debates and Enlightenment. But then in the 19th and the 20th century, all these people are reading Vico. Even now in the 20th century, I know all these, people who are theoreticians or not even 18th century scholars who are like, the real answer is rely on Vico, and they rely on this theory that Vico has about how we get from the age of gods to the age of men, right? Like he becomes, so I think it would be interesting to look at Vico in relation to some of this poet that I've talked about. It might be interesting to look at Rumi in relation to Locke, but I also don't want to reinforce the idea that there's a corollary to every Enlightenment writer, because that's also Eurocentric in its way, right? So
how do you spell Vico?
Vico. And the book is there's a book called The New Science. His major work is The New Science, which has recently been reissued, I think, by Penguins. So I also teach another class, not the Global Enlightenment, but an Enlightenment seminar. That's like an honored seminar, which is short form means that they get 2 credits, but I only get 1 teaching credit. But anyway, that course. I really enjoy teaching that course. And whenever we get to Vico, there's like a lot of energy in the room because there's something about the world we live in now and the chaos the students feel when they're coming into the world and when they're reading Vico and they're reading the way that Vico is going back and forth between myth and history and the way in which Vico is like, he's funny, but he's also kind of outlandish and eccentric, and it really resonates with them a lot. So that's Vico, Jean-Baptiste Vico, New Science. He's writing actually in the exact same time as Shahability in Naples.
I've been curious for a long time, is probably part of what we're doing here. I once got a call from a State Department official who was going to go and speak in Istanbul, of all places, about how the United States was the first country in the world to practice religious pluralistic tolerance for religions.
Yeah.
So I informed him that I didn't think that was the best place in the world to make that. But in any case, it got me thinking that certainly one component, despite the imperialistic attitude or the East-West divides or the idea of Oriental despotism and all of that, still, at the level of merchants, at the level of ordinary, ordinary, people who went out, the factors and so on, they would have seen multi-religious societies functioning basically all over the Indian Ocean, and as well as in the Eastern Mediterranean and in North Africa too, to some extent. So, what evidence of influence of their impressions of this that they brought back, can you inform us?
Oh, you mean the vernacular impression?
Well, sort of the idea, the idea that after this period of intense wars between different factions of Christianity, to say nothing of what attitudes about Jews were at that time in Europe, Here they are seeing Hindus and Muslims and.
I mean,
and-
so, I mean, if I
and
think
Jains and
about
whatnot.
this
Trading
text,
them.
what I find fascinating about this text is that, like, you don't know, I mean, that's part of the logic of Sufism. You don't know which creator they're referring to. It's not just the Muslim God, right? The creator is also this kind of polytheistic entity that, and the people that he's preaching to, most of them are Hindus. And he has himself all these poems that are about the yogis that are going up and down. So in this particular context, what I find interesting isn't just that he's not like promoting tolerance, because that's not an issue in the same way, right? And it's not, I also don't want to paint a romanticized picture in which everybody just got along. But this idea in which you have two different religions and they need to tolerate each other, I mean, that comes out of very specific debates in the 16th century, in which the first time the word toleration is used, it's a bad word, right? It's like, I have to tolerate the Protestants because, you know, they've been burning us at the stake for all this time, but I just have to tolerate it because this is just something that I have to do, like you tolerate a bad neighbor. So, I mean, in that sense, that particular level of brutality just had there was no context for that in the context of this particular set of poems. And there's lots of scholarship about, there's multiple other texts that are written just in South Asia that South Asianists study that are, you know, that are kinds of, you know, that point at this reality. And not just then in this sense of relationship between Hindus and Muslims, but all the other religions that are coming together in South Asia, including the Christians and the Jews. I think of Sanjay Subramaniam, and you know, I have problems with his work, but I think that as a picture that he paints of religious dialogue is it's compelling and very interesting to teach alongside European texts. And actually, one of the things I didn't say is that this class actually, if I go back, the class that it was itself adapting was a class called Cosmopolitanism and Toleration in Enlightenment Europe. And that class was itself an adaptation of a class that I taught at Scripps College called Cosmopolitanism and Coexistence in Europe and the Ottoman Empire. And in that other class, I was also trained, like one of my fields was Ottoman history. And I was really fascinated with, there were so many different ways in which like the debate over the wars of religion in France could have been, the scholarly debate could find use in looking at the similar debates that are occurring, you know, the scholarly arguments that are occurring about the nature of toleration and pluralism, the creation of the Ottoman Empire and all the other phases in Ottoman history. And it was actually really productive to read even the work of the really dry historians in Ottoman history next to the dry historians of European history, like, because they weren't referring to each other. And the students found it really exciting actually just to see, I mean, the question we start every class with was like, what would these two historians say to each other if they met? Because it's clear that they aren't referring to each other, but actually they're both talking about a similar problem in different contexts. And it was always really, really productive to actually have that conversation.
Can you recommend some of those texts, even though they are dry historians?
Sure, yeah. I mean, not all of them are dry. Well, one text so Bruce Masters, for the 18th century, Bruce Masters has a text. He teaches at Wesleyan. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It's called.
Didn't he write Aleppo and Devon?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So
is that the one?
Yeah, he writes.
That's a fascinating set of letters, by the way. I used that in a paper I wrote when I was here at Georgetown.
I mean, not only was it useful to my students, I found it just totally fascinating the way that he described Aleppo in the 18th century as a city it's not just about Christians and Muslims, it's like multiple forms of Christians and Muslims and Jews, and they're all acting together, and then, you know, like the Europeans are slowly making their inroads. It was utterly fascinating. I think it was just called Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire, but I think both as a context, we're thinking about someone like Lady Mary Montagu, right, who travels to Istanbul in this period and she's dazzled by the toleration of it also. But even she doesn't describe, you know, this, what Masters is able to see in these sources, in which, you know, also not just the different people living together, but the extent to which conflicts that are really about, you know, commerce get played out in stories about like the differences between the Greek Orthodox Christians and the Roman Catholics actually, you know, producing new levels of solidarity between different kinds of Muslims. I mean, I just think that like as a story it was fascinating. And it's not easily written. It's hard to access. I mean, I found it hard to follow some of what he's saying, and that's partly because the story he's telling is so complex. But it didn't if I assigned like, one chapter, students were fine. If I assigned it next to like, for instance, one of the professors I had was a Philip Benedict. He wrote some really interesting, pretty accessible stuff on the wars of religion in France. But I think it would be interesting to, to kind of to complement that book with some work on 18th century toleration. The other, I was trained by Jamal Kafadar as an Ottomanist. Not as an Ottomanist, but just as one of my fields in graduate study. And his own book he's written some really interesting stuff also on the Ottomans. He wrote this article in the Handbook of European History called The Ottomans and the Europeans, which not only did it help me understand that relationship, I felt like it helped me understand the origins of the European fiscal and military state better than the European historians could, because of the way that Ghaffadar lays out, all these crises that are produced by this idea that like, in order to wage war, you need to like set up this like incredibly complex fiscal regime of tax farming like that. Even though he wasn't talking about Europe, the story he told about it was just really, really vividly useful for me in thinking about all the stuff that's happening in Europe at that time. And that's historically accurate because the European system is so powerfully influenced by authors. Yeah.
I'd like to recommend at this point two teaching resources that I was privileged to participate in at George Mason. One kind of grew out of the other. There was a conference called Beyond Golden Age and Decline at the Ali Baral Ak Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. Rajiv Kinra was there. He's one of our later speakers this week, and Jamal Kafadar's name came up very much in that conference. Yeah. The videos from that and the panels are on islamicstudies.gmu.edu at George Mason University. And also a British Council project called Our Shared Past in the Mediterranean, which was followed upon that conference. And it's divided into 5 or 6 modules for each era of history, including the very beginning of the geological beginning of the Mediterranean Sea. But module 4, it does deal with this period, and it talks about, it quotes some of the letters and paintings that the factors who went out to Aleppo and places like that had paintings of themselves made. Yeah. So some of those letters are reproduced in there on a fascinating lesson on the connection between brocades and early computer programming, which is one I've always wanted to put down. It was digitization of design, actually.
And also, speaking of that, I want to recommend I'm forgetting I don't know how you pronounce Gulru Nechipoglu.
Yes, she was one of the speakers at that conference.
Yeah, so she's an art historian also at Harvard. I think married to Ghaffadar, or maybe was. I don't know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
could be.
I have no idea. It's a long time ago. But she wrote a really interesting piece on the tulip revolution in 18th century Istanbul. So it's about like, the importation of tulips in the 18th century and how it leads to all these crises inside the Ottoman Empire because tulips are associated with the West, and it's really, it was really, really fascinating.
And Jamil Aydin, who will be here later, was one of the catalysts. He was the director of the center at George Mason, the Ali Baral Ak Center at the time. So he'll be coming later in the week, and you can grill him for questions about those things as well. It'll be nice bookends for the week. So. We still have a few minutes if there's a last question to get every last drop from you.
Okay, the discovery of America revolutionized European thought.
Yeah.
Just kind of literally blew their mind. Did it have any similar impact on India or Asia in general?
The discovery of America. Yeah, there are lots of references in, the story of that discovery becomes important in the creation of an Indian historical consciousness, but more in the 19th century. And it's not a central theme or anything, but it's there, it's referred to all the time. And it's also referred to all the time by European writers that are describing this particular region. So there's one point, one of the writers I quoted says something like, we need to start prospecting this region and like figuring out how these rivers work, because like that's why the French lost India for that reason, and that's why we lost America, referring to the American Revolution, right? So like those things are completely linked, and the relationship between these two processes is also described by Jonathan Ecott has this book called Selling Empire, and really it's a book about how much all the events that are happening how profoundly all events are happening in South Asia are not just shaped by, but unimaginable outside the context of what's happening in America. But this question you're asking is also very interesting to me. I mean, I can't answer it properly because I am fascinated with, and not just the question of North America, but I'm especially fascinated, for instance, with what Indian intellectuals in the middle of the 19th century are thinking about the Spanish in Mexico. Like, are they interested? Like, do they think of those struggles as the same as theirs? And I don't think anyone, not that I know of, has properly studied that, but I bet that they do. So, I mean, I'd love to know more about that too. Sorry, you had a question?
I was just wondering if you could repeat the information about the article about tulips.
Oh, right. It was called, I'll have to Google that. It was called the...
I didn't retain enough to Google.
Okay, yeah. Age of Tulips, Neji, Tulip. Okay, I think that, I'll have to look that up, or I think if you look at Google Scholar and put in Tulip Revolution, you'll probably get a better representation of the recent scholarship on the subject, because I'm looking here already. There's so many books that I don't even know of.
I always find things that talk about what's going on in Europe, so I'm really intrigued by it.
No, yeah, I mean, it's,
How you can see it from the other side.
I'm wondering if, sorry, you had a question too? Somebody had their hand?
Oh, the same thing. What was the tulip book?
Let me see. I'm gonna. Thank you for Google. Google is. That's how you write the name. And there's actually another.
Can you put it back up to her name?
There was also another one. I'm trying to remember. So long ago. There was another article that. I mean, her work is really interesting, but there was one that was in some ways more accessible that I also assigned. I can dig that syllabus up and put it in the folder if that was useful. I think I'll have the names.
Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.